underway. So thanks very much for joining us today. And so I'll start with the introduction of the Williams Group and then me, and then we'll get right into the content. So yeah, the Williams Group's been around since 1987, so we're one of the longest standing consulting, financial services, transitions firms in the marketplace, professional services firms. We have 3 divisions. One is little known, but it's a fairly strong division within Williams Group, which is our accounting and tax. We have 3 licensed tax professionals, including myself. We do bookkeeping, and all our clients are ODs. Some of the people on the call today are tax and accounting clients, so appreciate that. So that's one division. Another division is transitions, which is this subject today of buying and selling, adding partners into practices, doing appraisals. So that's our transition area, and then our practice management consulting. So those are the 3 areas. I think we're pretty good at it. So we've got a lot. At least we're very experienced, that's for sure. And yeah, we've got some excellent people, great people working in all 3 of those areas of the company. So my name is Brad Rourke, and my credentials to qualified to be able to talk to you today about transitions work is, yeah, I'm an accredited business evaluator. I've done lots of evaluations, and I've been in your profession. It's been a blessing to be in your profession since 2003, so 22 years. So I've got a very good background from an operational evaluation, most aspects except for the clinical care that's left to you guys to do. So that's me and our background of the Williams Group. So let's move on, run through the agenda really quickly. We'll talk about what are the benefits of the buyer, because that's one thing. If you're a seller, you need to think about the benefits of the buyer, because it's like selling anything. You have to think about what the buyer wants. I mean, we're all kind of selfish. It's hard not to be because we are ourselves, etc. But putting our mindset in, what does the buyer want? We'll talk about that. And then different seller categories, because I think there's several. And then identifying who your buyers are. We'll talk about that briefly. And then when to start planning to sell or to exit. We'll discuss that. And then we'll discuss assessing your asking price. And that really goes to the subject matter of your optimal or ideal selling price or asking price. Then we'll discuss vetting buyers. If you got a buyer, that's great. So you don't need to vet them too much. If you got one, that's wonderful. We'll talk about that. And then we'll discuss really briefly the tax and sales structure. Just have a few comments on that. So moving right along. So the buyer benefits, I think these aren't necessarily obvious in a sense, because a lot of doctors I find, or practice owners I find today, I hear a lot about the struggles, you know, the challenges with managed care and staff problems and hiring associates and whatnot. But we're problem solvers by nature for the most part. So we kind of think about those things, but there's so many great benefits I tell the young doctors or buyers. So on that point, if you need want someone to convince a buyer that they should buy in or have them talk to us, because we're incredibly big proponents and advocates of buying into practices. Because as a practice owner, you can think about how that's developed your life personally, because you've had to deal with staff, how to manage staff. You've taken on that responsibility. You start to understand marketing, understand finance aspects of financial aspects of running a business, and then you're just more bought in, and so the whole thing just becomes a lot more valuable in a sense. It's a struggle, but the personal benefits of owning and putting equity into your own practice is absolutely fantastic. So there's a lot of folks now in the market that don't want to buy for various reasons. They want to be employees, and nothing wrong with that. But certainly there's a good portion of young docs or just doctors, even middle-aged doctors or doctors are getting up by my age that would buy and should buy. So yeah, there's just a lot of buyer benefits. So that's just something you should keep in mind when you're trying to sell your practices. How great has it been for you as a practice owner? And I would say that almost every one of you would say, yes, it's been worthwhile for sure owning my practice, even though there's been some struggles, but now I've got equity. And so that's the buyer benefit. And there's many, many more, but we'll just leave it at that. So you can picture yourself in a seller category. I've got 4 listed here. There's probably others, but this is going to be close enough. So there's a segment of buyers that legit know that you can sell, that you got a buyer and you might be a practice that's doing over $1 million, or you've got a partner already that wants to buy in, and you know that, or you've got a private equity knocking down your door asking you to buy, and you know that you can sell to them. So that's a smaller portion of the practices in the country, maybe, I don't know, maybe 20% or so. So you're in pretty good shape from a seller perspective. So we'll discuss more of the details on that as we move through. But second category I've got is it's a long ways down the road. So you might be just out of optometry school, or you're 30 years old, and then you want to own and run your practice for a while. So that's another category. So you're not too worried about it at this point. Fair enough. Then we get into a couple other categories that are a little more risky, I would say. So maybe you have a potential buyer, an associate that's on the fence, but there's an opportunity potentially to convince them that they ought to buy or should buy in, or because people will change their minds after they really see the benefits and what they could potentially gain from buying into a practice. But life can be difficult if you're, say, a professional mother, you've got kids, and then ownership seems like it's going to be too daunting or too much responsibility. But even then, I don't necessarily think so, but that's my view. But you're in a situation where maybe you've got a buyer and maybe you don't. And so that's a risky position to be in, especially if you get to be, say, well into your 50s, or you've got maybe a 5-year window, then you're in somewhat of a risky position of not being able to find a buyer by the time that you want to ideally exit. And then I've got the fourth category, which is no buyer in sight whatsoever. So I don't know, I'm a little surprised how many doctors are in this position. Maybe we just get a lot more coming to us because we have a marketplace. So I'm talking to doctors all the time, and we are throughout our company that they don't have an associate. And like I have down here, the practice in size practice size and location is extremely important on the sellability or the demand for your practice. Because if you're doing, and we'll go through some of the numbers and I'll show you why, but if your practice is doing, say, under 500,000 or under 7, it's more difficult to sell it potentially. Of course, if you're more rural rather than, but we are finding that more potential buyers are moving out of the big metro areas, moving out of LA or New York or whatever the case may be, moving to Boise or Utah or more areas where the housing prices are a lot less. But in general, if you're in a big metro, you've got a lot more demand for your practice. And if your practice is over $1 million, then it opens up the private equity market too. So, but the no buyer in sight situation where you don't have an associate, yeah, that's a risky situation. So those are just the categories in my view. And like I said, we'll talk a little bit about more, those things as we move along. Oh yeah, I put down the panic levels. So number 1 and number 2, you're not really panicking. Number 3, you're semi-panicking, I would think. And then number 4, yeah, you're a bit of not necessarily outright panicking, but it depends on how well you've done with your savings. Is the sale of the practice really important to you? But it seems to me that a lot of the practice owners that are in number 4 that have smaller practices that really can't sell them, they really want to just hand the practice to someone else. So price isn't necessarily as important, but the continuation of their practice, that their patients are taken care of. It's really important to providers, and that's really great to see. I started to kind of promote telehealth in a sense, and then humanoids, robots, which I think are going to come down in the future. So I think the rural practices there'll be more demand for them in the future, but that technology isn't quite there yet, but I think it's going to be. But so those are the seller categories. So identifying your buyer categories, and you might be able to fit into all of them, but some practices you won't. So we'll just cover these really quick. Most of you already understand these categories of potential buyers. So the highest paying, of course, are private equity for a number of different reasons. They've got cash, they got capital, and then they have economies of scale, and they borrow money. But typically they want more metro areas, some suburbs, but mostly metro suburbs, and then minimum over $1 million. But that's lowering in some places. For example, my doctor will buy practices that are 700, 750, 800. But they start out wanting $1 million. So if you can get yourself to $1 million, then you're in a metro area, you're in pretty good shape if you want to sell the private equity. And you're willing to stay for 3 years. So it's almost like no go if you're not going to stay for 3 years. They're not going to buy your practice because they need someone to see the patients. So that's one category. Next is corporate. I kind of put these together a little bit. So the corporates are VSP Ventures, Essilor Luxottica, buying practices. FYI out of Canada is starting to buy practices in California now. There's IMARS and Shopcos. So though that area, our buyer market, they're going to pay a little less than private equity, but the trade-off there, which is beneficial to you as a provider if you want out sooner, they will typically go. Sometimes they go 1 year, 2 years, so they don't all necessarily need you to stay and require you to contractually agree to stay for 3 years. So yeah, you might be eligible, so to speak. I hate the word say eligible, but I'm using that obviously, but to sell to these. But you can look at the other way around. In my view, is that yeah, they have your eligibility in a sense, because you're in charge of your practice and as the owner. But so then another category would be associates. So if you got an associate, that's absolutely wonderful. So even if you don't think that you need an associate, I always tell doctors that get an associate, and you can expand the number of lanes or open up on Saturdays or whatever, but do what you can to get an associate, and then try to hire an associate that is willing to buy in. And I always say, like, offer them early and often to have them buy in, because if you have an associate and then they want to buy in, then that's great. You could have them buy in at 10% or 20%, and we'll look at some of the numbers in a moment to show how that's going to work. But once you have an associate and then they agree to be a partner and buy in, then you potentially have an exit strategy, because you could sell the rest of your percentage of ownership, have a right of first refusal or whatever the case may be to sell to an eventual partner. But yeah, so I think if you're over 40 or hitting 40, then I would say, yeah, get an associate and have them buy in as soon as you start offering them, or tell them and convince them of the benefits of buying in, because then you've got an exit strategy. Because I think if you once you get to, say, you can either use it ideal time to retirement. So I would say absolutely within 5 years, you've got to be starting to think about your exit strategy, because it's to PE, they want 3 years, and then if you don't have I would say 10 years out, if you're a rural area, bare minimum 10 years out, you start trying to plan for your exit, because you might have to go through a few associates. You might have difficult finding an associate, but you can sort of work that situation by potentially encouraging one of your staff to go to optometry school, because that's going to take them 10 years. Or you can go to the local chamber of commerce and promote optometry in general, just do a talk about it in your practice and bring patients in too, but tell them you're looking for someone to buy in and about their career, so you can kind of control that. But that's got to be a 10-year plan. So 5 years bare minimum, regardless of the situation, you should start planning, and then 10 years for sure if you're more rural and don't have an associate. You're sort of in that situation. So that's associates, and then it goes, then if you're not selling to an associate or a partner, existing partner, then you're looking to the outside world, so to speak, to find a buyer. And the number of those are declining a little bit, but there still are lots of buyers in the marketplace that want to buy practices for good reason. I'll show you why here in a moment. But now they don't know you, they don't know your practice. So certainly selling to an associate or a partner or eventual partners is more optimal, easier to get done, faster to get done. But selling to a peer who doesn't know you, wants to move into town, or say it's another practice that's within 20 minutes away that might consider buying your practice, those are other options. But so those essentially are the four categories as I see the market as to who the buyers are, who your potential buyers are. So I touched on this a little bit already, so when to start planning. So it really depends on this category here. So private equity for sure. If you think you can sell that in like 5 years out, because you got to work for 3, and you're probably looking at a year of negotiation potentially, and just vetting the various private equities. Same with corporate. You could go 4 years, but you got to know that you could have a chance to sell to corporate, and you can start talking to them, or have us talk to them for you about a potential purchase. And then if you're, again, associates, you got to start 10 years out or early as possible, and to try and find associates. So those are sort of the timing on when to start planning. So 5 years for private equity, potentially 10 years out, I'd start trying to buy an associate, and then the sooner you can get someone to buy in, the better, in my view. Because now they have equity, they're not going to leave, et cetera, and they're bought into the practice. So absolutely work on getting a partner. Okay, so assessing the asking price, or optimizing your asking price. So let me check the time here. Yeah, we're doing pretty good. So I want to just run through some numbers, and it'll give you some context, and we'll see if we can do 3 different scenarios. One, which I have it teed up already, an $800,000 practice. Then we'll go to, say, a $3 million practice. I could sell to private equity, and then we'll go to, say, a smaller practice that's $500,000 or $600,000, which most of you probably aren't in. Maybe 1 or 2 of you are, but so we'll just go through those 3 scenarios. So I'll probably end up jumping around a little bit here, but I'll try and keep the train of thought so you can follow me here. But all right, so context: $800,000 practice, and then let's just assume it's a solo practice, 1 doc, no associate, which again is not ideal. But and then these are the categories typically: your cost of goods sold, your staff costs, your overhead, your occupancy costs, and then your marketing costs. So I kind of refer to those as the big 5, even though marketing's not that big. It's really big 4 plus marketing, but call it big 5. So those are all your operating expenses that are going to give you your cash flow before paying doctors or loans or leases or capital expenditures. So really, this operating net here, and this I've got pegged at 30%. So every dollar that comes in, your practice is generating 30% of sort of discretionary income if you're the sole owner. Which is pretty average. So we're going to go down, just show you a couple of different scenarios here. But so what would this practice potentially sell at? And you have to look at a practice being sold, your practice, as an investment. So I'm going to invest in a recurring income stream. That's what I'm buying. I'm buying a lot of potential. Obviously, I'm buying your goodwill and your equipment, the returning patients, but really the investment side of it is I'm buying cash flow. Because if a practice isn't making anything, like no cash flow after paying the doctor, really I'm just buying a job. So the investment isn't really worth anything. So it has to have some sort of cash flow in addition or in excess of what you're going to pay a doctor to do the work, even if that doctor is yourself. So doctor comp, I've got it 17%, which is pretty normal in a sense. So 17% of 800,000 is 136,000. So if you're doing the work, fair enough. If you have to hire someone and you just own this as an investment, then of this 240, what I get is 104,000. That's what I'm really investing in. That's because I got to pay a doctor, even if it's myself, 136, and I'm left with 104,000 left over. So now we get into the EBITDA multiples. So most practices that are around this level sell between the market value is between 3.5 to 5 multiple of EBITDA. So I have this at 4.5, so 104,000 times of cash flow. Multiplying that by 4.5 gives me a selling price or a purchase price of 468,000. So you probably heard this rule of thumb that practices under $1 million, if they're averaging about 30% operating net, they will sell for the market value is roughly 60% of their top line. So that kind of proves out here in a 4.5 multiple, because it ends up being 59% or 60% of top line. So that's roughly correct. But you can go down as, like, depending on the demand, at 3 times, or as high as potentially 6. But on average, it's a multiple of 4.5, give or take. 3.5 to 5.5, give or take. So on that scenario, what that means is you'd have an offer or an asking price of 468,000, or 59%. So this is where I'm going to take a little bit of a sidebar, and this will apply to whatever level of practice you're at. If you have 2 million, 3 million, or 400,000, doesn't matter. So I'm going to move into what's the buyer situation. And this is not private equity, but another peer or another doctor. So if they're going to pay 468,000 for this practice, and they're going to basically do all the work themselves, they can see all the patients, so they're essentially going to get 240,000. That's what they get. Then of that 240,000, then they are going to pay tax on that, say 24%. It's more complex than this because year 1 or 2, etc., you're going to have if you buy a practice, your tax rate is going to be a lot lower because you could deduct a lot more. But let's just assume that they don't take all the bonus depreciation and all that stuff, and so their federal tax rate is 24%, and then state's 5%. So now the other 240, they're going to pay 57,000 of tax on that. They're going to pay 12,000 state tax, and then on this 468,000 that they're going to pay you for your practice. So if we go down to, let me just put this in here. This should actually be purchase price at 468. So, okay. So you can borrow around 5.5% now on conventional loans through Bank of America or Provide or whatever. So you borrow 468. I'm borrowing that to pay you 10 years. It's 120 months, so it's $5,000 a month or 62,000 a year. That's my principal payments to pay the loan. So I got to pay my tax, then I got to pay my loan, and then maybe I want to put some equipment in or refurbish some equipment. So I put that, say, at 80,000 or 5 years, so that's 18,000. So on this practice, my take home after paying the loans, paying the tax, maybe some equipment loans also, I'm looking at taking home a net of 90,000. So that's kind of okay. I can kind of live on 90 after tax, because at, say, 140,000 or 130,000, it's tight though for a lot of people. So that's just kind of the number. So if you go down even lower to, say, a $600,000 practice, I'll go $500,000 practice. And then, but they don't sell at 4.5. It's more closer to 4 at the most multiple. So yeah, that's closer. Say 52% of the top line. So you're going to pay 260. So for the practice. So in this scenario, you're going to generate $150,000 off the 500, assuming your operating net's 30. So I'm going to get 150. I'm paying tax 36, paying 7,000 of state tax, 34,000 of practice finance loan. I'm going to borrow this 260, and then I'm probably going to, I might even have more. In smaller practices, sometimes they need more equipment, but I'll still leave it at this. So it's 53,000 I have to live on, and I'm probably not going to be able to do that, given it's America. So I'm going to have to supplement my income elsewhere, go work somewhere else, or really try and push this $500,000 up. So that's why it's kind of smaller practices when you're trying to sell your asking price. Your asking price in general needs to take into consideration, obviously, the buyer and what can they afford, because they're not going to buy it. But you can make these scenarios work at, say, easily a $900,000 practice. You're looking pretty good in my view. So, and then these practices, the operating net is usually a little higher, say at 32. And then, if you can get, I'm just thinking from a buyer's perspective, if they can pay a multiple of 4, which is essentially they're paying you 540, that's 60% of your gross. So on that, the numbers work pretty well. So that's another thing. So if you're a $500,000 practice and you want to sell, I know it's difficult to say this is what I've been doing, but the higher you can get your gross, because we just had a situation not too long ago that the revenue does matter, because the numbers, what you're going to be able to take home out of the practice, unless you can and doctors can do it, you can change and bring in a lot more revenue quickly and start seeing more patients per hour, and depending on how long the seller is booked out. But say on this $900,000 practice, the numbers work great. So as long as if you start paying someone to see patients, not so much, because then you actually do have to kick out some of this to someone else. But generally, a doctor could do $900,000 without too much difficulty. So that's 288. Now I'm taking home after tax 100 grand, so I got 10 grand a month to live on. So I can do that, like most families can. So so that works. So the point here is just keep in mind, how's it going to affect? What's the buyer's net? What are they going to end up paying after? What are they going to take home? Because that doesn't matter to you, fair enough, but it does matter to the buyer. So oftentimes it's a matter of trying to convince the buyer that they can do it, because a lot of docs come out of school, and I always tell them, look, buy the biggest practice you can buy, because let's just say you're buying a $2 million practice, or you're 3 or 4 years out, then you can finance that. And I mean, you have to get an associate or whatnot, but you're at 276 if you might be paying 80 grand out for an associate or something, but then you're still at 100 after tax. You're $180,000. So it makes a lot of sense for doctors to buy in. So, and I also just want to touch on then I'll talk about private equity multiples in a second. So just back down to this $1 million practice. Now, and this is why this is such a great investment. I'll even go smaller, it doesn't matter. We'll go down to a $700,000 practice. So the asking price on that would be 420 at 60% and a EBITDA multiple of 4. So if I take, so really I have to take this 119,000 out, because I'm not working for free. So that leaves 105,000, or if it's a pure investment, I'm paying someone else, but that gives me 105,000. So if I pay $420,000 and what I'm getting is $105,000 a year return on that, on EBITDA, that's 25% return. It's phenomenal. So even though you might not be able to live on that, but you can supplement it somewhere else. But investing in private practices is an awesome return on investment. Because where else are you going to get 25% on your return every year? And then you can increase that to 30, because your original investment's only going to be 420, but you might have some equipment, but whatever. So great investments. So let's better move along here pretty quick. So let's just talk about, say, I'll go to this I'll just use $1 million for a private equity situation. So normally they're going to pay, they're not going to pay 4, they're going to pay 6 to 7. So say 7 multiple on EBITDA. So the reason why they can pay more, they have their efficiencies, they've got centralized economies of scale, and they've got capital. Most doctors, like say if I was going to buy your practice, I don't have $1 million sitting around just to pay you, and I can't, the banks won't lend me that much to buy your practice. So that's one of the reasons why practices values tend to be 70% of the top line or lower, because the banks just won't fund it. They won't go any more than 75%. So this valuation here at a multiple of 7, so you've got $1 million practice, private equity will definitely pay $1 million for it, if not more. So, and certainly if you've got a $5 million practice, then yeah, you'll get a definitely higher multiple than 7. That's why private equity is so attractive to people, because the return. But the actual returns, as you can see here, is lower than a solo doctor buying a practice, because the private equity folks pay so much more. So they're only at 14%. So they're going to get $150,000 a year. Their investment is $1 million. So their return on this $1 million payment they're paying you is only 14%. So yeah, that's just the way the market is, but they can pay it and they're happy to. But some practices that get up into the $5 million range or higher, then you can, that's only 1 times revenue, but they are paying 10, but they have their own way of calculating EBITDA, so that's 150%. So if you're in this category, you've got lots of options either to sell to your associates or partners or sell to private equity. But so yeah, I think that's probably enough on the numbers. But yeah, so your ideal selling price may not be the buyer's because of the loan payments, but you can convince, and we can help you do that if you want, because I love doing this stuff. Just saying, look, doc, I'll get your guys' numbers. This is what your cash flow is going to be. This is what your return on investment is going to be. So if it's back down to that $900,000 practice or whatever the case may be at 4, they're earning 25% return on their money. It's great. So let's just toggle back over. Oh, one other thing I was going to mention. If your financial statements are not in this format, in these big sections, cost of goods sold, staff, overhead, occupancy, marketing, so you can see what your operating net percentage is, you should get your financial statements in this format. So QuickBooks is really easy. You just reorganize things. So this is just kind of us really quickly on this. If you're our client, tax and accounting client, you're already in this format. But you've got your cost of goods sold section, your staff costs, marketing costs, occupancy costs, like I mentioned, overhead, so those big 5. So then you have your net operating income on QuickBooks, and then you can see what percentage this is, your operating nets, because if your operating net's higher, then your EBITDA is going to be higher, so your practice is worth more. So really knowing what this number is really important. Then just put everything else down below, like other income, credit cards, other small equipment, and your leases, because all that, none of this is included in EBITDA, and then the doctor costs, because you can pay yourself whatever you want if you own the business. So have all, and then discretionary costs down here, non-operating discretionary costs. So you want to keep this area up here really clean. So if you're going to sell, I'd start putting it in this format now, so that you can you can really see what your operating net is. It's really important. And we have actually clients, other brokers and whatnot, just asking us to, with their clients that they're representing to private equity or whomever, to help put the financial statements in this format. But yeah, another thing too, I guess if you're running any personal stuff through or even like discretionary, keep those all down below your operating net and keep them out. So automobiles, entertainment, meals, travel, all that stuff, don't put it up in this area, because that's going to lower your operating income, which is going to lower your EBITDA, which is going to lower the value of your practice, and that's how they're going to see it. because it's hard to tease out, say, office expenses. Well, what did I do? But so use different credit cards or something so that you're not commingling discretionary with like required operating expenses for your practice. All right, so that was assessing the range. So just real rules of thumb. Private equity is going to pay 1 to 1.5, even sometimes 2 times your revenue. Corporate is going to pay more like 1 times your revenue. And then doctor range is going to be at the highest 70% of your revenue to as low as I've seen, like 40% for practices that the doc just wants to get out and wants to. So those are sort of the asking price ranges. Yeah, real quick, so I'm going to run out of time here. Vetting buyers, don't be too picky. If you can be picky, be picky. But if you've got a doctor, because we find that like once a doctor goes and meets another doctor, yeah, they usually hit it off pretty well because you have a lot in common. You're both licensed professionals, et cetera. But yeah, you got to know why you're selling and keep that in mind, because you don't necessarily want. It's nice to have a lot of people interested in your practice, but there's a spectrum between I want top dollar. That's all I care about. I just want to maximize my return. Fair enough, and I'll work for anybody or anyone buy my practice. That's what I want. Or to what's most important to me is my patients, and then the continuation of my practice and the name of the practice and how it's been run historically, and the name on the wall or the door, all that, or how the acquiring practice or owner is going to come in and what their scope of their practice, personal, how they want to practice. So there's that. Most doctors are kind of in the middle or a little bit more toward the money. Fair enough. But then that'll move just depending on the situation. But I guess that's all I'll say. Yeah, just know your objective when you want to sell. Is it, and there's nothing wrong saying I just want to maximize my return on this, and that's it. I'm going to hand it off to someone. I know they're going to practice differently than me, and even I do sell, and they want me to stay on. I'm going to get on board with them and how they want to run the practice and get behind them. But if you don't think you can do that, then yeah, it can cause some problem. But so just know what your objectives are and be really upfront with if it's private equity, just be really upfront with what you want. Tell them what you want, how you want to practice, and then they're going to tell you what their intentions are. And then same with any other doctor that's potentially going to come in and either buy your practice, even as a partner or your associate. It's a little easier there because they've seen how you function. But still, if I'm buying into your practice and you're used to making all the decisions, and now I'm a 50 or 40 or I'm a minority shareholder, even an equal shareholder, you really want to get that operating agreement sorted out, saying how are we gonna, what are our HR policies, what are our investment policies, what's our scope of practice, like how are we going to practice together. So and it's always great in my view to have someone to practice with, just like in tax. Like I love the fact that we have 2 other licensed tax professionals and we can run scenarios by each other and whatnot. So it's great having someone side by side. So super quick, only two ways. You can sell your stock, which is rare, or you're going to sell the assets. There's different tax consequences to each of those, but most sales, 100% sales are asset sales for the most part. You keep your own company and you keep your liabilities, but then someone just buys all your goodwill and whatnot out of your practice, and then they form their own entity or move it into their own entity. But if you're buying, so those are asset appraisals, and then stock sales are typically a partner buying in at say 50%. So they're not going to buy 50% of the OCT, and the operator, they're going to buy 50% of your equity. So they get 50% of your liabilities also. So whatever and your cash. So if you're sitting on $500,000 of cash or something in your practice, or 300, they buy into your practice at 40%. They own 40% of that cash. So you want to distribute that out before they own that 40%, any excess cash. And then financing is important too. So you can ask your potential buyers just to get, the banks will run credit reports. They'll just basically give a kind of a thumbs up. They won't necessarily give an amount. that they'll finance. It's not like a home loan, because if they don't have the practice data, like your gross revenue and what your operating net is and all that, the banks don't have that, then they can't say, okay, yeah, we'll give you $1 million or $1.5 million or 500,000. They can't give a number, but they will say, look, yeah, we will finance this person because they have good credit, and really that's about it, you know. And from a financing point of view, they've got the license to practice. So I could go on about the financing thing. There's lots of nuances with the banks of what they will fund and what they won't, but that's probably for a different. Yeah, since we got 3 minutes left. So yeah, so that's it, you guys. Other than like I mentioned, we have the marketplace for our practices, and then we can help with any of this sort of thing, and we'd like to do it, and I think we're pretty good at it too. So let me just see if we have any questions. Good. All right. Let's see here. What's the difference? The practice is part-time practice at 500K. Is this better for the owner to find an associate and then sell, or sell outright? Well, if you can sell outright and you want to sell, then sell outright. But if you don't want to, you're still a ways out. Even in the small practices, yeah, get an associate. Yeah. And it's really good for you as a professional too, if you haven't had an associate before, like many of you have, and you know that it just takes a while to just find out how you're going to get along with that person. Are they going to practice at the level you're going to want to practice at, or do they want to practice differently? But yeah, but you can expand your scope of practice with having an associate. So I'm always an advocate, regardless of your size of your practices, to get an associate and then offer them ownership as soon as you can. If you're 30 or 20, you see yourself working for another 30 years, then no. But once you hit, say, 40, then you got 20 years, 25 years, and I don't know, it's hard to continue practicing, you know, for say 30 years, because you just, you know, it becomes, yeah, you just don't have the desire anymore. It's like boxers or something. They got 20 fights in them or something, and that's it. So yeah, the sooner you can get someone, it might be the better, for all those reasons. Working with someone else, having a potential buyer. Yeah, so start early, in my view, and given your particular practice situation. So, all right, well, we're at the top of the hour, and yeah, we're probably going to do a series of these sorts of webinars, just talks, etc. Financing is a big issue. Tax issues are a big issue. The pricing is a big issue. And also when you get into the sort of the deal, the closings, all that's interesting too, from a letter of intent through potential due diligence to the closing and the financing, and then the private equity deals, if you're, you know, that's part of your, so it's an interesting flow with both the attorneys and whatnot. But yeah, we've done lots of transactions, so we can certainly help at whatever level that you want. So all right, everyone. This is my cell phone. You can call or text, and my email is here. I'm happy to talk to you, or if you have a buyer, like I'm saying, oftentimes when I'm on with doctors, I'll tell them, look, if they're associates on the fence, they don't know, you have them talk to me, and I can run some numbers with them and just basically tell them how great it is to own, from a return perspective and from a personal growth perspective. So, all right, thanks everyone. I'm gonna just close it out, and like I said, hope you have a great weekend, and thanks very much for hanging out for 45 minutes or so. All right, bye.